Helena Vieira da Silva, generally known simply as Vieira, is Portugal's foremost 20th century woman artist. Born in Portugal in 1908, Vieira took out French citizenship and lived in France from the 1920s until her death in 1992. Her work, which owes a debt to both Portugal and France, achieved international recognition as an important representation of French post-war painting, and is regarded as belonging to what is known as the Paris School. Considered against this background, Vieira's work stands out for its luminosity and its persistent capacity to use figurative allusions, elements which conjure up reminiscences of Portuguese tiles and landscapes. Let us go back to the year 1944. At that time, the devastation wrought by the Second World War was spurring European artists on to live life at a faster pace. In many cases, they felt called upon to express the tragic circumstances of life at that time in their own work. At the outbreak of war in 1939, Vieira left France with a Hungarian painter, Orpod, who had shared her life for many years. After a short stay in Portugal, she settled in Brazil, where she lived from 1940 until 1947. Vieira painted some of the most fascinating pictures of her career while in Brazil, including O Desastre and Tragédia at Sea, painted in 1942 and 1944 respectively. In both works, a tense sense of drama quite uncompromisingly expresses the feeling of panic and the horrors of living through a war. In Tragedy at Sea, the painter is alluding to the title of a collection of dramatic tales of shipwrecks and catastrophes undergone by Portuguese seafarers on their travels to explore the oceans and discover countries previously unknown to Europeans. The book occupies an important position in Portuguese literature and at the same time is a historical record of great significance. Vieira's picture records the heart-rending drama of many of these stories, while simultaneously creating a parallel with events experienced in the war raging then. The sea, as a threatening, unknown enemy, inspiring terror, but at the same time tempting us on, can be seen as a metaphor for that war. All the elements in the picture combine to express abject terror. The composition emphasizes the vertiginous situation of groups of people who are reduced to formless masses and sucked into the catastrophe. The contrasts of color raise the emotional temperature of the picture, reminding us of the brutality and horror of that period. The way people are portrayed too, with each individual becoming a small, indistinguishable part of a mass condemned to extinction, reinforces the apocalyptic vision of humanity threatened by war. All these elements indicate such profound emotional turmoil. This picture completes the general image of the artist's work, where reserve and harmony are seen as the predominant characteristics. This vision, in Tragédia, continues the theme of the earlier painting, O Desastre, also known as guerra, war. In this picture, which contains clear indications of futurist influence, a similar group of shipwrecked people, driven by blows of fate which determine their direction and lead them into brutal conflicts, can be recognized in the direction of movement determining the composition. Vieira successfully conjured up masses of bodies which collide and mangle one another, thus creating simultaneously an effect of confusion and an infinite fragmentation and splintering of the pictorial space. These came to be characteristic features of all the artist's later pictures. And yet, the chaos seems to be pervaded by a mathematical order. The 1950s were a decisive period for the acceptance and recognition of Vieira's work. Her career was marked by an increasing number of exhibitions and sales of her works in a number of countries. And the pictures were also bought by the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris. She and her husband, Orput Senesh, were granted French citizenship in 1956 and built a house with a studio in Paris. From then on, they led a peaceful, secluded existence there, keeping contacts with the turbulent outside world to a minimum. They concentrated solely on their artistic work. During the 1950s, Vieira's compositions became increasingly simple, while the figurative elements became less clear. Even so, landscape remained a constant source of inspiration. Sky and sea suffused with light, the fields and the ports, canals and aqueducts, the towns and their atmosphere, were still references and sources of her inspiration. From the artistic point of view, the special way in which her paintings are organized is still the key to unlocking the mystery of Vieira's pictures. The labyrinth of the perspectives, the detailed rhythms in the play of horizontal and vertical lines, the continual splintering and decomposition of the picture surfaces, the effective reproduction of the many different gradations of brightness, the subtle treatment of vistas, and the progressive dissolution of the horizon, all of this becomes increasingly vague in effect. Vieira da Silva developed these characteristics into a distinct and unmistakable personal style during the many decades of her creative career. The 1964 picture, Les Degrés, The Steps, is entirely representative of her work in the 1960s. It can be perceived as a completely abstract exercise in composition, but alternatively, it is also possible to see in it reminiscences of the steps in old Lisbon. Or consider L'Air du Vent, painted in 1966, a picture which at first glance again seems to be an abstract composition and exercise in perspective. But it can equally well be seen as the distant horizon of a harbour. Vieira's tendency towards lyricism never beguiled her into a complete repudiation of the world around her and her origin. Despite the international acclaim she enjoyed in the context of post-war French painting, she never forgot her roots either, her memory of Portuguese history, and her own involvement in it. Tragedy at Sea is an unequivocal example of this double attachment to Portugal and its history.